Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Today, I want to do a quick chat about the Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, short story collection by Ken Liu. And following this chat, I will also just do an update on what I'm currently reading, as well as have a drawing to choose my next read. So stay tuned for that. But back to the Paper Menagerie. I just finished this a couple of days ago, and it was published in 2016 by Ken Liu. The short stories had been published, some of them in other places like magazines. The Paper Menagerie, one of the stories is actually titled The Paper Menagerie, and it is the first work of fiction to have won the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Award all in the same year. And then Ken Liu also first came to really my attention, I think, through the Three-Body Problem, that trilogy by, science fiction trilogy by Cixin Liu, who is a science fiction writer from China whose works, at least the Three-Body Problem, was translated by Ken Liu, and the Three-Body Problem is the first work of the first translated work to win a Hugo. So I was real curious and anxious. I had heard good things about this short story collection by Ken Liu, and since I'm not a real big short story reader, last year, at the end of the year, when I was sort of setting some reading goals for 2017, I thought, one thing I did is try to pick a couple of areas that I wasn't used to reading, like memoir, short story collections, and biography. And this was the short story collection that I chose to read. And I'm just now getting around to reading it, and it turned out to be a real pleasure. And now I'm kind of wondering why I have not been reading short story collections all along, because it was very readable and very enjoyable for me. I think maybe I'd had a couple of bad experiences with short story collections years ago that maybe colored my perception of what to expect from a short story collection, but in any case. So this is a collection of, I didn't count the stories, but it's several stories. Like I said, science fiction and fantasy. And Ken Liu is a Chinese American, and so many of the stories sort of reflect that cultural perspective, which I found really engaging and really intriguing and interesting. What I thought I would do is just run down the titles of each of the short stories. I'm not going to give anything away about any of them because they're all too good, and I wouldn't want to spoil the reading of any of them. But okay, the first one's called The Bookmaking Habits of Select Species, and this is basically kind of a survey of what books look like among different cultures in the universe, non-human cultures, obviously. The second story is State Change, and this is about our souls. A woman has a soul of an ice cube, a literal ice cube. So that story was really interesting. The third story is The Perfect Match. This story sort of explores artificial intelligence, and it's either its invitation into our lives or its intrusion into our lives, depending on your perspective. The next story is Good Hunting, and this really explores the magic of places and things, and this takes place in China with a mythological being of China. I love this story. The next story is called The Literomancer, and this really explores the magic of words. I think this literomancy has a cultural tradition in China where the Chinese characters have a magic themselves. So I don't know a lot about that. It's mentioned at the end he mentions something about this at the end of this story, so I took it to mean a real thing. So I need to look up a little more about that. The next story is called Simulacrum, and it really explores snapshots of our lives, like snapshots of people, and how that can become one sort of moment in time with our interaction with another person can really turn that person into a static photograph, basically. This story explores that idea. The next story is called The Regular, and this is really a murder mystery with technology, with near future. It's a near future murder mystery, recognizable world to our own, but with some different technology. Okay, the next story is actually The Paper Menagerie. This story really explores trying to fit in identity, trying to figure out your identity. This story, I think, really comes from the place of his Chinese American heritage. I really felt that through this story, and it's a beautiful story. And it's the one that won the awards I mentioned earlier. Okay, the next story is called An Advanced Reader's Picture Book of Comparative Cognition. This story explores ideas of thoughts and memories and how we think, or not just us, but other species around the universe. The next story is called The Waves, and it's about life and, choosing to live, or choosing actually to let yourself die in order to make room for the next generation. That's sort of our rhythm of life as humans, right? So this story explores that. The next story is called Mono no Awari, and I'm hoping I pronounced that right. And this story really explores the individual versus the good of society, or the societal good. The next story is called All the Flavors, and this is really a telling of the Chinese immigrant experience of like the 19th century in the Western U.S. So that story was really interesting, and there's some Chinese mythology thrown in there too. The next story is called A Brief History of the Trans-Pacific Tunnel. A Brief History of the Trans-Pacific Tunnel. And this story is an alternative history of the 1930s, where there is a Trans-Pacific Tunnel constructed, and how that changes the history of the 30s and therefore the history of the world. Then the next story is called The Litigation Master and the Monkey King. This was really one of my favorite ones. The Litigation Master is kind of a fixer. He lives in a small village in China, and this is in some ancient time in the past, and people come to him to fix problems. He has a communication with the Monkey King. So this mythological being, the Monkey King, and I love the Monkey King. I wish I had the Monkey King appear to me and have a conversation with me, because he's really cool. And then the last story in the collection is called The Man Who Ended History, a documentary. And this really explores the question of who actually owns the past, if anyone. Who has responsibility for the past, or who owns the past. So really a lot to think about in that short story. So yeah, that's all the stories. Like I said, they were all very engaging. I really did enjoy reading through them. There were recurring themes of memory and time and society and how to fit into society and the needs of society versus the needs of the many versus the needs of the one, sort of the individual versus the good of society, or the good of other members of your family. There is also quite a lot of Chinese mythology and Chinese folklore and tradition that are interwoven throughout all of the stories that I found just so engaging and so poetic and beautiful. I read last year a couple of books in a fantasy series called The Dragons of Heaven. Was the first one, and I did a book chat on that. But it was kind of a light fantasy read, but it also included Chinese mythology and this type of thing in with its fantasy narrative. And I found that really fresh too, and I'd really like to see that incorporated more, because it's just such a rich mythological tradition that I think especially here in the West, here in the U.S., we're not as familiar with as we could be, and it's very enriching. It would really enrich, a lot of stories, I think, to include it. So I'm really glad that he did. I just wanted to kind of end the chat, though, with a quote from the first story, which is called The Bookmaking Habits of Select Species. The quote to me is just a beautiful sort of quote about reading, which is really, appropriate for a book chat, right? So the quote is this. And remember, the story is about books, what books are like around the universe. And so this is actually the ending chapter. Pockets of sentience glow in the cold, deep void of the universe, like bubbles in the vast, dark sea. Tumbling, shifting, joining and breaking, they leave behind spiraling phosphorescent trails, each as unique as a signature, as they push and rise toward an unseen surface. Everyone makes books. So I thought that was cool. Yeah, so I'm going to leave the chat for the Paper Menagerie and other stories with that. Great read. Glad I got it on my reading list this year and got it read. I will be reading more short story collections in the future, not just science fiction, fantasy. If anyone has any suggestions for me, collections that they've particularly enjoyed, then please, by all means, leave them down in the comments. So what I'm reading now, let me just pull that up and give a bit of an update on that. I am reading Zone by Matthias Einar. Let me get the cover. There is the cover of it. Kind of clunky to get around in my iPad to show you the nice color graphic of the cover because I'm reading that electronically. Yeah, so I'm about 20% through. This is written in one long sentence, and so it took me up to about 6 or 7% to get into the rhythm of how he writes. But now that I've kind of gotten into that rhythm, also the punctuation commas are not where you might expect. But I've gotten used to that actually now, and it's kind of a stream of consciousness thing. I wouldn't really say stream of consciousness so much as a reverie, as this man journeys by train from Milan to Rome after a long career in the Secret Service of France. So this is what it's about so far. It did, like I said, take me a while to get into the rhythm of it because it's written in such a unique way, but now that I have, I am enjoying it, and I should be finished with it fairly soon, and I will have a chat coming up about that when I do. So let's get to the drawing for my next book to read after I finish Zone is going to be, have 10 left on my must-read list for this year. And the next one is going to be The Jazz of Physics. So The Jazz of Physics, let me pull that up for you so you can see the cover. There is the cover of it. This is by Stefan Alexander, The Secret Link Between Music and the Structure of the Universe. So it's been a while since I read one of these science kind of books, but this author apparently, I think he's a physicist, if I remember right. This is just from memory. And he also likes jazz, and he explores that topic. Let me see if I can just find a description for you here. Maybe we can just do it that way. More than 50 years ago, John Coltrane drew the 12 musical notes in a circle and connected them by straight lines, forming a 5-pointed star. Inspired by Einstein, Coltrane put physics and geometry at the core of his music. Physicist and jazz musician Stefan Alexander follows suit, using jazz to answer physics' most vexing questions about the past and future of the universe. So yeah, should be interesting, and I will, of course, have a chat on that when I've got it finished. And until next time, take care.